Gute Woche. The Rebbe soll gesund sein, began the Farbrengen this afternoon, that this is the Shabbos between Yud and Yutes Kislev. Unlike every year, when there's a span of days between Yud and Yutes, we always must have a Shabbos in the middle. Shabbos, Rebbe continues, has two inyonim. One inyan in Shabbos is how Shabbos has a shaykhs to the following week. Based on the famous expression, Shabbos, minei mizboch in kulhu yoimin, that Shabbos gives bracha into the entire week. So this is the Shabbos that gives bracha to Yutes Kislev. This Shabbos, however, also has a shaykhs to the entire week that passed, and if it has a shaykhs to every week, every day of the week, it definitely has a shaykhs to the Shabbos that passed. And the Shabbos that passed is the day of Yud Kislev. The Gemara says, Misha tarach be'erev Shabbos yoichal b'Shabbos. One who prepares on Erev Shabbos, he has for Shabbos. So what does this show us? This shows us the concept that the entire week has a shaykhs to the oncoming Shabbos. The same when we are talking in this Shabbos today, this Shabbos has a shaykhs to Yutes Kislev, as well as a shaykhs to Yud Kislev. And Bechlal, the Rebbe continues, in every inyan, we always like to find a heroic lesson, what we can derive from this, especially based on the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov teaches us that anything and everything a Yid comes across, there's an inyan of Hashgacha Pratis. So we have to find the Hashgacha Pratis. We have to derive a lesson from this entire inyan, from the combination of the Mittler Rebbe's day and the Alter Rebbe's day and so forth. And here the Rebbe says that Bichlal, we're talking lately a lot about Bias HaMashiach. And the truth is that the inyan of Bias HaMashiach is discussed in Chumash right at the beginning of the creation. There's a pasuk right away in Bereshis, in the beginning of Bereshis. The pasuk says, "V'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamoyim." So there's a Chazal, a Medrash, that interprets this pasuk. V'ruach Elokim, the Medrash says, "Do ruchoi shel Mashiach." So this shows us right away that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, He right away created ruchoi shel Mashiach. Rebbe says, right after this, we have another inyan that has a very obvious shaykhs to Mashiach. And that is, when Hashem said, Vayomer Elokim, the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yehi Oyer, that there should be light. So, Chazal tell us that the light which HaKadosh Baruch Hu initially created, the Lichtigkeit, was a very strong and powerful light that the world was not able to survive, was not able to hold out with such a strong light. And the Chazal say, Gonzoi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu hid this light. V'heichon Gonzoi, where did He hide this light? He hid it for la'asad lavai. So, if we go a little bit further in Chumash, and we'll learn about this Maimer Vayomer Elokim Yehi Oyer, which the Rebbe stressed how this is an important Maimer in the creation of the world. Here we again come across the importance of Mashiach, because we're talking about the great Oyer, about the great Lichtigkeit, how the world will be illuminated when Mashiach will come. But even before that, we have the pasuk V'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamoyim, right away telling us about the importance of Mashiach. Now the Rebbe is getting back. This was like the Rebbe usually refers to it like a Maimer Hamuzga, something which comes like in parentheses. He discussed this inyan. Now he's coming back to Shabbos. B'negei Shabbos we find Chazal tell us, Ma hoyo olam chosa menucha. Ba Shabbos, ba menucha. That when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the end of the sixth day of creation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu finished creating the world, and the world was a complete world. However, Chazal say, what was the world lacking? There was one thing that the world was lacking, and that is the concept of rest, menucha. And this was instituted by creating the Shabbos, because Shabbos is rest. The Rebbe says, actually, the world in itself was a complete inyan at that time. In other words, it was a davar chashuv in itself already. It was something worthy in itself. However, there was some other very important and worthy thing which was still lacking, and this is what Shabbos adds on. The same, when we are talking about the connection, how Shabbos is tying together Yud Kislev, and Shabbos is tying together Yutes Kislev. In other words, Yutes Kislev is something very important in itself, in its own rights. And the same when we're talking about the days of Yud Kislev, all of these days have their significance. However, Shabbos adds on something, the fact that Shabbos is tying together these 2 days adds on something, gives something additional. Just like we were talking here, how Shabbos gave something additional to the world. It doesn't mean that the world was no world without Shabbos. The world was a world, and actually everything else other than the concept of rest was already created. The only thing, Shabbos added something. The same when we're talking here, how Shabbos is adding into Yutes Kislev and into Yud Kislev. These days are of great significance in their own rights. However, Shabbos is adding something more to them. Based on what the Rebbe discussed last week, Rebbe continues how each of the Rabbeim corresponds to a different one of the Sfiras. And as discussed last week at length, it is the Mittler Rebbe who has a shayches to Sfiras Habina, and as the Rebbe kept on stressing last Shabbos and other occasions, Rechoivos HaNoho. That is the whole inyan of Bina. Bina elaborates and really puts things in a very broad spectrum. That's the whole inyan of Sfiras HaBina. So the Rebbe asked this afternoon the following question. The Mittler Rebbe was the Alter Rebbe's son. And therefore whatever he had, he took from the Alter Rebbe. He was the Alter Rebbe's Memala Mokim. He replaced the Alter Rebbe. Here we are saying that in the date sequence, the inyan of Yud Kislev comes prior to the inyan of Yutes Kislev. In other words, the inyan, the contribution and the stress of the importance of Sfiras HaBina comes before Sfiras HaChochma. Sfiras HaChochma is the inyan of the Alter Rebbe. Sfiras HaBina is the inyan of the Mittler Rebbe. How could this be? We know that the Seder HaSfiras says that first comes Chochma and then comes Bina. As the Rebbe explained, that being that it is in this way that Yud Kislev is before Yutes Kislev, and on the other hand, Sfiras HaChochme comes before Sfiras HaBina, and here we say that Bina comes before in the calendar. In other words, Bina is Yud Kislev and Chochme is Yutes Kislev. So the Rebbe is explaining that the Mittler Rebbe, whose inyan is Sfiras HaBina, is giving us an additional, to put it, an additional harchava, rechoivos hana, in the inyan of Chochmah. Like the Rebbe brought an example. He says we begin learning the Svarim of the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe's most known sefer is the Sefer HaTanya. So there's the way how we learn Tanya, as we would learn Tanya mitzad itself. So how do we teach Tanya? Tanya meaning we learned in a Baraisa, and we continue learning the Perik Tanya. However, if we approach to Tanya, and we learn Tanya in a much deeper way, then we have this is the inyan, which Bina is adding on Chochmah, which is in our Oisius, how we are talking about it here, the contribution, the addition of the Mittler Rebbe on the Alter Rebbe, then we understand Tanya in a completely different way. The Rebbe was talking at length, simply demanding from us to get involved and learn in Yonim Chassidus in a way, in a format of Rechoivos Hanor, really getting involved and in learning these Inyanim, understanding them properly in a very broad way, an in-depth way, which is what Sfiras HaBina stands for. The Rebbe brought an example, how an Inyan could be learned in its Pshat, and we could take the same Inyan and go and learn it much deeper, and at the same time it doesn't take away from the Pshat of the Inyan. And so the Rebbe chose a very famous Inyan. He says, the opening of Mishnah. Mishnayos begins with Me'ei Mesai Koyre Neshma B'Yarv. Actually, it's a halachic question. From when are we allowed to lay in Krishma in the evening? The question is Zman. However, it's brought in Svarim, that Me'emesai has a deeper taich. Me'emesai meaning from fear. Ema. Ema means fear. What brings one to learn Krishma? Krishma means the acceptance of the yoke of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When we fear HaKadosh Baruch Hu, out of fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is when we can really read Krishma properly. The Rebbe says this is a taich which the Maggid related to the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe says it's brought in Svarim from Rishonim, from Rabbi Yishaya Ditrani, who was a Rishon. That Rabbi Yishaya Ditrani said, why is it that Mishnayos opens with this Mishnah of Me'emes HaKoyer Neshma B'Yarvin? The Rebbe said, actually, this Mishnah has no shaykhs to the Seder of Zroyim. The Seder of Zroyim, after Masechta Brachos, what is discussed? All different types of questions regarding growing and planting. All these type of inyanim are discussed. Here we have a Mishnah which opens this particular Seder that raises the question, from when are we allowed to recite Krishma in the evening? So Rabbi Shai Ditrani said the reason for this is because this is the first mitzvah which a Yid has an opportunity to fulfill. When a child becomes Bar Mitzvah and he becomes 13 years old, so what is his first mitzvah? When does he become 13? As soon as it becomes night. As soon as it becomes night, what can he do? He goes ahead and he dams ma'ariv, thereby he fulfills the mitzvah of Krishma. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, in many of the Shasen, there is an introduction to Shas in the back of the first volume. And there it is brought, based on the pasuk, Reishes Chachma Yiras Hashem. The first thing in wisdom is to be God-fearing. That is why this Mishnah was chosen to be the opening of Mishnayos, because this Mishnah talks about the reading of Krishma, and the reading of Krishma is the inyan of Yiras Hashem. So that is why Reishes Chachma Yiras Hashem, the first and foremost is the concept of Yiras Hashem. That is why the Chazal have arranged it in such a way that Mishnah should begin with Me'emes HaKoyer Neshma B'Yarvin. So here the Rebbe was talking, comes out that this is getting back to our inyan. He brought this only as an example how we have an inyan that can be taken very, very simple. And after all these taichen in Me'emes HaKoyer Neshma B'Yarvin, we still remain with a simple taich, which means that simple question from when on are we allowed to go ahead and recite the Krishma by Ma'ariv. The same is when we're talking about learning in Yana Chassidus or any inyan in Torah. It could be learned in a very simple way, and it could be learned in a much deeper and yet deeper and an unlimited deep way. And which this is what the inyan of the Mital Rebbe adds on. This is the inyan of Rechoy V'Sano. And this is something which is demanded from each and every one of us. Here the Rebbe says that in Poland, there was a shitta, the Polish dynasties, famous concept which explained, there's a pasuk, v'tzadik b'menoso yichye. So Polish Hasidim used to interpret this, v'tzadik b'menoso yechaye. In other words, if we have emunah, if we have belief in a tzaddik, this in itself gives life. Chabad disagrees with this. To what extent? In other words, let me explain myself properly. In other words, the Polish Chassidim, with the philosophy was that we would believe in the tzaddik, and the avodah of the tzaddik, whatever the tzaddik would do, would be sufficient for us as well. In other words, he would be mighty us, and all the high level avodas of dedicating himself to the Eibishter, davening and avodas Hashem, and being constantly in Eved Hashem, he would do it. And if he would do it, by us believing in the tzaddik, this would be sufficient that it would have an effect on us. This is, however, not the shita of Chabad. While the Rebbe says this, he says, amongst the crowd there are definitely some Polish, and he doesn't want to start up with them. But nonetheless, he says he should, I'll forgive him. The shita of Chabad is that we must do everything ourselves. And Mamela, when we're talking about this inyan, it's also that it's demanded from each and every one of us simply to get involved in learning Chassidus, and learning Chassidus to an extent of deeper and yet deeper, as much as possible for everyone to dedicate himself to the inyan of going deeper and deeper in a more broad and broad way to understand the inyanim which are explained in Chassidus. Towards the end of the Sikha, the Rebbe got back to what he spoke about last week and a few weeks ago, where the Rebbe spoke about the importance of Simcha, of serving the Rebbe through Simcha. Quoted the famous Rambam. Rambam tells us that David HaMelech was a mefazez or mecharker. David was clapping his hands and banging and going totally out of himself when it came to fulfill a mitzvah. So, saying we have to derive a lesson to be totally involved, that when we feel all the mitzvahs we fulfill should be fulfilled with the highest level of simcha possible. In this sikha, incidentally the first sikha went for over an hour and a half today. In this sikha, the Rebbe also mentioned another reading which he spoke about in this sikha, and he spoke about again in the second sikha. And it's one of these things which the Rebbe speaks about, and as we will see in a minute, when the Rebbe tells us he doesn't want anybody to go around mentioning names, what he's referring to, or guessing what he's referring to, but he discussed this inyan. There's a Gemara. Gemara is Masechta Yuma. The Gemara there discusses the concept of Chilul Hashem. What means when one desecrates Kodesh Baruch Hu's name? Gemara there says, in fact, Gemara Masechta Yuma, the Rebbe expressed himself, this is the Sugya Masechta Yuma, which the entire Geras HaTshuva is based on. There the Gemara says that certain Ameira, look at I'm referring his name, it slipped my mind. A certain Ameira expressed himself. Kegoina no. Dishakilna bisra mibeit hapcha. In other words, the Ameira referred to himself. If he will buy meat from the butcher, and he wouldn't pay him right away, it will also be an inyan of Chilul Hashem. In other words, this Ameira was supposed to represent an inyan of being a proper God-fearing Jew. And in Mele, he had to live up to higher standards than a regular person. In other words, what we derive from this Gemara is that the inyan of Chilul Hashem, this is how the Rebbe explained it, is not the same by everyone. Like there are certain things which ordinary people could get away with. However, when we're talking about somebody who is higher than the ordinary, then they cannot get away with it. On the other hand, the Rebbe brought out a different thing, a different nekuda. When a Chilul Hashem is caused, it reaches a certain amount of people that a Chilul Hashem happened. In order for it to be corrected, it can only be corrected when those people who are aware of the Chilul Hashem are also aware that it is corrected. Otherwise, it still remains a Chilul Hashem. And the Rebbe spoke about this at length, and again, he spoke about it in the first Sikha, and much more detail in the second Sikha, where but again, we know where the Rebbe likes talking about things and doesn't mention names, and he also says certain things that have been happening, and again, stressed very strongly how we have to be careful in the inyan of Chilul Hashem, that Chilul Hashem is something which Chazal tell us the worst about. In other words, there's no Aveira that's equivalent to Chilul Hashem. So that is why it's something we have to be very careful by. At the same time, we have to know how to judge that there are certain special individuals, special people like we see from this Gemara itself. Those that we cannot expect them that they should feel zich like regular people. And thereby, when they do things, their things are extremely accurate and extremely... Every move has to be thought over and pre-planned and so forth. Otherwise, it could lead to Chilul Hashem. Talking about this inyan, Rabbi said, he was referring to the Gemara says the butcher this Amir who was always careful in paying the butcher on time. Rabbi also mentioned that there's an inyan by buying an esrig to pay right away for the esrig. Otherwise, we're coming into a problem of lachem. Is it considered yours or isn't it considered yours? Because we have to own the esrig when we bench on the esrig. Rebbe says he doesn't know why, but the Frierdiker Rebbe had a custom that he would buy the esrig before Sukkot, and always, it was every year that way. In other words, it wasn't just one exception. He would always pay for the esrig around Chanukah time. Why he did it, he doesn't know, but it's a fact. Getting back, he mentioned it. Here on one hand we're talking how, but this seems like was some sort of a special thing. Why he acted that way? Let us get back to our Inyan. Now here the Rebbe is continuing, though we just discussed specialty of this Shabbos, how this Shabbos is tying together Yud Kislev and Yud Kislev. However, there is something special in this Shabbos because of the fact that it is Shabbos Pashas Vayishlach. Especially based on the famous quotation of the Alter Rebbe, we have to live with the times. In other words, we have to derive Inyanim from the Parsha, from the Seder of the week. So first of all, the Rebbe raised a question in Parshas Vayishlach, which he elaborated a lot on the question. The beginning of the second Sikha came back to it again at the end of the second Sikha. And the question, he did not answer the question, but the question is, we read in the beginning of this week's Seder how Yaakov was preparing himself to meet with his brother Esav. And Yaakov was, as we read in the Chumash, he was preparing himself for all different types of confrontations. He was ready to go in the good way, give him a present. He was ready for a milchama. He was ready for tefillah. He used all different types of approaches of him meeting Esav. At the same time, Pasuk concludes, Ad Ovay El Adoni Seira. So Chazal tell us that Yaakov, at that time, was already at such a level that he was ready for the coming of Mashiach. He was ready for the coming of Mashiach, and his brother Esav was far, far from it. So the Rebbe is asking, it is explained in Svarim, Kabbalah and Chassidus, that Yaakov was Midas HaEmes, truth. And Yaakov was the highest, Titin Emes L'Yankov, there's a pasuk. What does this show? That Yaakov is totally associated with Emes. So if Yaakov used something, he used it with the highest epitome of truth. How could it be that Yaakov at that time did not evaluate his brother Esav properly? Yaakov on one hand says, Ad Ovei El Adoni Sira, he's ready to settle with Esav to an extent for the coming of Mashiach. He's finished all of the Birurim, he's finished all of the Nitzutzos, and he's ready for Mashiach to come. He was Mavarer everything already. And at the same time, Esav was ready to go to war with him. I mean, this is a tremendous abstract one from the other. And if Yaakov is viewing things als Midas HaEmes, and Midas HaEmes is true to the fullest minute point where there is no room for kihu zev, any drop of non-truth, how was it that Yaakov sort of did not evaluate Esav properly? That's actually what we're seeing here. Otherwise, why is he mentioning that he's ready for the coming of Mashiach? Esav is so far, and so remote from this, he has no shaykhs to this, and here he's talking about it to Esav. And on the other hand, Yaakov Taka did prepare himself with actual preparations which were needed to confront his brother Esav. This is a question which the Rebbe left as a question. And he again came back, what is the lesson which we can derive from the inyan of Parshas Vayishlach? The Rebbe said, Vayishlach means to send. To send, and the pasuk goes right away ahead, Malachim, messengers. What does it mean? The idea of sending shluchim. Sending emissaries. Reaching out. Reaching out where? Vayishlach Yankov Malachim El Esav Achiv. The Rebbe is teaching. It is our inyan today to reach out with emissaries, with shluchim. We ourselves have to reach out to anywhere where we know we have a brother. And the Alter Rebbe teaches us in Perek Lamed Beis of Tanya that every Yid is our brother. So anywhere, wherever there is a Yid, we have to reach out with the concept of shliches and get close to him and see to it to bring him close to us, bring him close to the Rebishter, bring him close to Yiddishkeit, bring him close to Torah, bring him close to Chassidus. This is the lesson which we derive from today's Seder. Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim, and Rashi tells us Malachim Mamish, that over there he really sent spiritual Malachim, but as far as we're concerned, it's inyan of sending shluchim, reaching out to anyone that can be defined as an achiv, as a brother. Though on one hand we may look at him as an Esav. He's a Yid who unfortunately at the moment is still an Esav. However, is he Achiv? Is he my brother? And every Yid is my brother, regardless what kind of spiritual level he is, regardless what kind of spiritual situation he's in. He is my brother, I have to reach out to him, I have to send shluchim, I have to send emissaries, and myself reach out to see to it, to bring this Yid closer to the Vayishlach. Later on the Farbrengen, Rebbe said the Maimer, Margele, beginning with the Gemara, Margele bepum Yidarav, there was a quotation by Rav, based on a pasuk, Rechava mitzvascha me'oid. Now the Rebbe said this Maimer today, it's interesting, this week was Yudalit Kislev. Yudalit Kislev is the Rebbe's wedding anniversary, and at the Shabbos of the Sheva Brachas of the Rebbe in the year 1929 in Tafresh Peites, the Friedeke Rebbe said a Maimer also beginning with these words. So that is why the Rebbe today also said this Maimer. In the middle of the Maimer, Rebbe mentioned a very famous Chassidish quotation. It was a quotation of the Friedeke Rebbe Siches, Tracht gut, wird sein gut. Think good, and it'll be that way. The Rebbe says the stories, this quotation is tied in with many stories which the Rabbeim related, but as far as we are concerned, we have to live up to the concept of Tracht gut, wird sein gut. Let us think in the right direction, let us think good, and it'll be that way. And the Rebbe spoke about two other inyanim. Number one, the Rebbe spoke about that tomorrow there is a dinner for the yeshiva, for Yeshiva Temchat Mimim, for the Lubavitcher yeshiva. And here the Rebbe spoke, referred back to this yeshiva, which was founded by the Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Nishmas Eden. The Rebbe Nishmas Eden, when he founded this yeshiva, he spoke about that his intention is that all of the disciples of this yeshiva will be Neiros Lahoyer. The Indian of the yeshiva of Temchat Mimim is to raise students which will have lichtik, they will be spiritual candles in their own rights, which they will illuminate others. This is the whole idea of the yeshiva of Temchat Mimim, Neiros Lahoyer, licht, to make lichtik elsewhere. I've also referred that there's a famous Sicha from the Rebbe Rashab, from the founder of the yeshiva, which he spoke a short while after he founded the yeshiva, and he tied it in with a Gemara. The Gemara says, Kol hayotzei lemelchemes beis David, koisev get krisis leishtoi. Gemara tells us that anybody that used to go out and join the forces of David HaMelech would write a divorce to his wife. So the Gemara says, al pi halacha. And halacha, it's explained that in case Chas v'Shalom he does not come back from war, then there shouldn't be any problems with his wife being an aguna or similar type of problems. But it was, the Gemara explains it, that this was like a conditional type of divorce. If in the event he doesn't come back, then the divorce is in effect. If he comes back, then the divorce is not in effect. The Rebbe Rashab spoke about it at that time, and it's stressed by the Rebbe at many occasions, and the Rebbe spoke about it today as well, in the spiritual sense. We today, Tmimim, are Yoitzei L'Melchemes Beis David. We are going out in a spiritual war, and the war which has a shaykhs with Beis David. The union of David HaMelech is David Malka Mashiach. We are involved in a battle to bring Mashiach closer, to see to it that Mashiach already comes. As the Rebbe spoke about a little later, Ad Masai, how much longer will we be in Gullus? It's already the highest time for Mashiach to come. So what is our inyan? Koisev get krisos liyishtoi. What's the pshat? It means we have to divorce ourselves from certain gashmis dikenyonim. We have to, in other words, if we want to be involved and be true soldiers in the battle of bringing to the coming of Mashiach, we cannot at the same time be involved in all the, have our heads in all the gashmis dikenyonim and all the gashmis dik enjoyment and all the gashmis dik pleasures. So that is why we are told, Kol hayotzei lemelchemes beis David, koisev get krisus leishtoi. We have in of Isha, it's explained in Svarim, stands for the concept of Gashmias. What do we have to do? Kaisev get krisis liishta. We have to divorce ourselves from having our heads involved in gashmistic enjoyments. We have to, if we want to succeed in the battle and of Milchemes Beis David, this is the requirement. So therefore the Rebbe spoke, this is the greatness of this institution, the uniqueness of it, raising such type of Talmidim. And the Rebbe Rashab, definitely Adayoim, still taking an interest in this yeshiva from the spiritual world, from Gan Eden. Therefore the Rebbe blessed this affair with a lot of success. He says definitely that he's confident that people will participate in this, and there'll be a participation in a form where Ishes Reyehu Ya'azoyru, one will assist the other to get involved more and more in helping such type of an institution. Another union which the Rebbe spoke about is the Malava Malka, which is taking place tonight for Neshek. Which this is, Rebbe says, if we want to see the importance of Neshek, we find it in the Seders we've read recently. This is when Yitzchak married Rivka, and Rivka at that time was a 3-year-old child. What was the test? If Rivka is going in the footsteps of his mother Sarah, so Chazal tell us, he brought her to the tent of Sarah, his mother, and Chazal interpret right away that just like by Sarah, it was Neir Doluk Me'erev Shabbos La'erev Shabbos, her candle was lighting from the Friday evening to the next Friday evening. The same thing Sarah, the same thing Rivka, when she lit the candles, it also had the same, worked the same way than by her mother-in-law Sarah. So here the Rebbe says, here we see the importance of the union of Lichtbenchen, how much lichtigkeit the 3-year-old child could bring into the world when we're talking about it in the spiritual sense as well. Because this is what the Torah tells us, and we to derive lessons from all of the inyanim which we come across in Torah. The Rebbe also blessed tonight's Malava Malka with success. Here the Rebbe spoke about Malava Malka is the union of Sudas of the David Malka Meshicha. Malava Malka is something which we do after Shabbos, after we have already finished the Shabbos, and we have made Havdalah. And after Havdalah, we make a Bracha Achreina, which is all steps actually that we're going away further from the Shabbos. Then we eat Malava Malka. What is Malava Malka? I'll explain an interesting word. He says Malava Malka is we bid farewell to the queen. In other words, to bid farewell to somebody, he still has to be present. Otherwise, you can't gesegn sich with him. So the same thing, if we say that Malava Malka, we are baglating the Shabbos, we are bidding farewell to the Shabbos, and when do we do it? On Shabbos night. So we must say that spiritually the Shabbos is still present, the Shabbos is still with us, Matzah Shabbos. Otherwise, how do we gesegn sich with it? So Mamela, the union of Malava Malka is a very special time. It's an union that has a shaykhs with David HaMelech, Sudas of David Malka Meshicha, and Shabbos is still present when we're reading Malava Malka. So it's a real gehoiben, a real high atmosphere, the union of Malava Malka. The Rebbe gave mashke for the Malava Malka. By the time all of this happened, today's short days, it was pretty late already. Must have been around, I would say around 4:30, 20 to 5. And the Rebbe still didn't start learning the Rashi and saying anything on the Zohar or the Rambam. So the Rebbe began, and he says that it's getting late to Mincha, to Kriyas HaTorah. He says, on one hand, that's how I understood it, that on one hand, it's getting late, so like maybe we would do away with learning the Chumash. But on the other hand, being that it's a custom that we've been into, though it's in a format of Belin Neder, it's not in the meaning of a Neder to do it every week, but it's not a promise, it's not an obligation, but at the same time, being that it's a good thing that we do it, so why break it? Rebbe says, he will do it, but we will do it briefly. And he raised a question, a very interesting question in today's Parsha. It's in the Parsha of Chamishi, of Thursday's day. Rebbe says Thursday was Tesvav, 15 days in the month. 15 days is a special date. It's Kaim Asiyah Reba Shlomus. It's the day when the moon is in its completeness. So we begin in Chamishi. Vayetze Dina. Dina went out. How does Rashi comment on the pasuk Vateitzei Dina? Being that the pasuk says Vateitzei Dina bas Leah, Dina the daughter of Leah. Actually, the pasuk should have said Vateitzei Dina bas Yaakov. Why is the pasuk referring to her as Bas Leah? So Rashi says, Nikreis Bas Leah v'loy Bas Yaakov. Why does the pasuk refer to her as the daughter of Leah, not the daughter of Yaakov? Ela al Shem Yitziyasa. Because of her going forth, she was Vateitze. Nikras Bas Leah, that is why she's called the daughter of Leah. She'af hi yatz onis hoisa. Leah was also one who goes out. This is a very strange pasuk and a very strange Rashi. We know that there's a concept throughout the entire Chumash, Zeicher Tzadik Levracha. Whenever a Tzadik is mentioned, it's always to praise him, to bring bracha. Here we are mentioning Leah, who was a Tzadikis. We're talking one of the Emahis. So what does Rashi say? Why does the pasuk here mention Leah to tell us, just like Dinah went out, the same Leah was outgoing. It's not a compliment on Leah. And still Rashi interprets the pasuk this way. And the Rebbe says, in fact, there are other prints of Rashi where there's two more words added on. And now some Chumashim, we have it in the parentheses. After this interpretation, that Rashi says, Ki ima ki bita. Mother like daughter. Daughter like mother and mother like daughter. The Rebbe says, it's very, very strange. We're talking about Dinah, daughter of Leah. So what could Rashi find for a reason why the pasuk mentions Leah, Bas Leah, not Bas Yaakov, with such type of a reason? This is not a covet for Leah. The Rebbe was explaining how we came to it, but we're talking about Dinah. Dinah here was a child. She was a young child. In fact, if we will make a calculation, the Rebbe says throughout the Psukim, comes out that Dinah here was a child, a 5-6-year-old child. And the pasuk says, "Vateitzi Dinah Bas Leah." Asher Yolda Yaakov, Liroi, she went out to look, Bivnei Sa'aretz. She went to look at the daughters of the land. So the Rebbe says this is not understood thing. Psukim later tell us in detail of the problem that happened where? With Shem. So where did this take place? In the city of Shem. Why does the pasuk use the expression Lirois Bivnei Sa'aretz? She went to see the daughters of the land. She didn't go. She went to see the daughters of that city. Still we see the pasuk uses Bivnei Sa'aretz. The Rebbe did not answer this. He just said, raised the questions. I don't know if on this or on the Indian of Rambam, he did say that he would believe it for at the next occasion. Regarding the Rambam, he also spoke very brief. Today's Shir and Rambam, we have the last Perik of Hilchas Mikvois. In the Shiurim of 3 Pakim of Rambam a day, beginning with the last Perik of Hilchas Mikvois. And the last Perik of Hilchas Mikvois, thank you, the Rambam discusses concept of mikvah. The concept of mikvah, that is an inyan of a choik, it's something which there's no rational explanation to the whole idea of mikveh. And the same thing we should have an inyan of a spiritual tahara, being pure from improper thoughts and improper acts. The Rambam brings the pasuk v'zarakti aleichem mayim tahoirem v'tahartem mekoltem eseichem mekol gululeichem atayereschem. The Rebbe will pour on us mayim tahoirem and will make us pure from all the impure. And the Rambam concludes, Hashem berachmav harabim mekol chet v'ovein v'ashma yitarenu. The Rebbe should make us pure from everything. Amen. The Rebbe spoke about it in the spiritual sense that there's an inyan of a tara b'mayon, a tara in a well. Normally, there's a mikveh. We could have tara in a mikveh, and we could have tara in a well, in a mayon. And here the Rebbe is tying this inyan of mayon to the concept of afatas hamayonos, which is also a mayon and also a well, but a spiritual well. Spring, thank you. And in halacha we find that a mayon is metaher b'kol shehu. Though a mikveh needs arbaim sa, a mayon does not need the halachic requirement of arbaim sa. This does not apply there. A kol shehu, in other words, anything which the object or the person can just tovel himself in, that is enough. Another inyan, the Rebbe says, another difference in halacha between a mayon and a regular mikveh is, according to many Rishonim, this is not according to all, that a mikveh, if the water azoichlin, if the water is flowing, the water goes out of the mikveh, at the same time going in and going out, we cannot be zechtovel in that mikveh. The mikveh is not metayel. However, by a mayon, if the water is zoichlin, it does. In Hilchas mikveh, there's an expression. There's an expression of hashboiren, an expression of zoichalin. Zoichalin means when the waters are flowing. Hashboiren means the waters are gathered. So a mikveh, the waters have to be in an hashboiren. However, if they are in a zoichalin, they are not metayel. By a mayon, according to many Rishonim, even if the water are zoichalin, it is also metayel. Yes. So, talking about it now in the spiritual sense. So the Rebbe is explaining this is the whole uftu of afatas hamayonos. In other words, this chelik of Torah, which is we refer to it as a mayon, we're talking now about nimis haTorah, that this can bring tahara.
More English.
This can bring tahara. This can bring purify even those who are not tahara, and by coming into contact, becoming associated with the inyan of Pnimius HaTorah, which is this Torah Sachsidus, this uplifts them and brings Tahara to them, even though they're only getting a little bit of it. In other words, the halacha, just like even a kol shehu, even a little bit of it, von deswegen, this brings Tahara to them. Which is the whole inyan again of Yutas Kislev. Rabbi stressed again the accomplishments of Yutas Kislev, the inyan of Afatzas HaMayonis, of reaching out to everyone with the Mayonis of Chassidus and bringing Chassidus to the Chutzah, so that every Yid should get involved with Torah Chassidus.